Well, hello everyone, just grabbing my microphone here, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're going to talk about the death and life of Jim Morrison. And I mentioned death first because it was on this day in 1971 when Jim Morrison left us. Some say that not only did he leave us in a literal sense, but he also left the world, although there's always been some conspiracy and controversy and mystery surrounding whether he actually died. The other members of his band attest that he did, although there was no autopsy, the burial happened quickly, and there were other mysterious events. But Jim Morrison was definitely seen as an enigmatic and a mysterious figure on stage. But behind this, he was a surprisingly regular guy who had very interesting and creative and original ideas. There's a page on Facebook. I know Facebook no one uses it anymore, but for this I do. And it's called Vintage Los Angeles, and it's run by Alison Martino, who's the daughter of the great sort of classic pop singer Al Martino. And she dedicates it to people who have lived in LA or live in LA or who are curious about LA. And the Doors being one of the most important bands that were formed and had their origins in LA. She talks about the Doors every now and then. And she recently posted a very rare audio recording made by a journalist who was interviewing Jim Morrison when he and his girlfriend and another friend were at a house in West Hollywood ordering some delivery food. And you hear Jim on the phone talking to the guy at the restaurant about this is the address and this is what we'd like. And it's all very normal, all very articulate and very polite. And the reason that I think that's important, beyond just a bit of trivia, is that it does a disservice, I think, to the true artist that was Jim Morrison to think of him as a man, as some sort of lunatic, drugged out, sexed out creep. And although Oliver Stone is a great man and a great director, he's quite guilty of portraying Morrison in that way. In his film, you can see why Hollywood, which Stone was still friendly with at that time, would want to push for a film that puts the myth above the man. But the fact of the matter is, Jim was an artist and a poet through and through. But that didn't mean that when he was off the stage, he was crazy. He was quite sane, and he was very much into his art, very much into his poetry. Before that, he was equally into his filmmaking. But when he joined and formed the Doors, the filmmaking sort of became something that was transformed into music making. And the Doors' music was very cinematic. Now, Jim Morrison, contrary to what his own father actually told the media, is actually a very good singer. When you listen to his vocals, you can see that he has a great deal of dynamic control, wonderful phrasing, and he's able to write lyrics that only he could really deliver with sincerity. You could put him in that same category with John Anderson, someone who also had very exotic lyrics, John Anderson of Yes. And if someone else were to sing it, and others I've tried, including with Yes, it's just not the same. And the same is really the case for Jim Morrison. Now, the Doors were great musicians, the three men who played in the Doors on their instruments, because Morrison stuck to vocal work. And this was, of course, Ray Manzarek on keyboards, John Dennismore on drums, and Robbie Krieger on guitar. And these three men would have likely have had success in the music industry no matter who ended up singing with them. But superstardom was really when the vocalist Morrison and the three musicians came together. And there's a reason for it. The three musicians in the band, the three instrumentalists, I should say, were all very unique in their own right. They didn't go out there and say, right, we're going to play like the other pop bands, the other rock bands in LA. And the real famous ones at that time were a band called Love, who have they were they were huge in LA in the late 60s. Then they became a bit forgotten, and they've had a kind of revival in the last 15 years or so, albeit not a huge one. And the other band that was super popular in LA at that time were the Byrds, 12-string folk rock type of music, very sunny. In general, the song 8 Miles High was quite heavy for its time, but all of it was very different than the Doors. It was much more folky, where the Doors said, we're going to play very dark rock, inspired a lot by jazz, a lot of improvisation, and even some tinges of classical music here and there. If you then combine that with the very moody, smooth vocals of Jim Morrison, you get something that really eschewed the kind of bright, sunshiny psychedelia and folk music of Southern California at that time. And you go into something that is much more moody and mysterious, so to speak. And it was that combination of the four men that created that. Now, each of the Doors albums is really a classic. Some were sort of instant classics. Others, like The Soft Parade, took a bit more time for some people to get into. Some people have criticized Waiting for the Sun, but that was the album where Jim on record declares himself the Lizard King in the song Not to Touch the Earth. And that album has also got the Doors' most prolific anti-war song, Unknown Soldier, a great anti-Vietnam song. And of course, the first two albums have always been instant classics. The debut album is still my favorite Doors album just because it made such a marvelous introductory statement. Here we are. This is what we're doing. And to begin with Break On Through and end with The End. Simply fantastic. And of course, the live performances of the end that have been heavily documented, including in the famous Hollywood Bowl performance, shows just how committed Jim was to his poetry and how he was able, without any props and without a lot of fancy stage lighting, to recreate a cinematic atmosphere with just three instrumentalists and a vocalist. And yet it was much more cinematically compelling and authentic than a lot of bands that did go in for the theatrics and the light shows and all of that type of thing. And the second album, Strange Days, picked up where the first left off. When the Music's Over, another wonderful song, and the title track, absolutely incredible. And of course, everything that the Doors did was good. They never put out a bad album. Morrison Hotel was seen as them returning to their roots after the Soft Parade experimented with horns and other sounds. And then their final album, although they didn't know it at the time, LA Woman, has loads of instant classics. My personal favorite from that album, Riders on the Storm. That wonderful Fender Rhodes piano of Ray Manzarek, and that great lyric, some would say the best lyric of Jim Morrison. So, of course, the band has been mythologized, and there's a lot that's been said about various incidents of Jim taking his trousers off on stage and all the rest of it, which the band always have denied. But the fact of the matter is, they were actually a very professional band. Another thing that Oliver Stone got wrong was the Ed Sullivan appearance. In Oliver Stone's recreation of it, Jim Morrison intentionally sings the lyric, "Oh, we couldn't get much higher," after the producers of the Ed Sullivan Show told him not to, where in real life, because obviously it was on TV, the clip exists, it's all over the internet, you can see that he sung those lyrics perfectly normally. And the story was that he'd just forgotten, because when you sing a lyric one way, so frequently, you just sort of, it becomes natural to you. And so that's another myth. It was just an accident. They didn't necessarily forget. Sorry, they didn't. It wasn't that they didn't want to not comply or whatever. So again, I think it's cool that they sung the original lyric, but it's important again not to mythologize, because that really takes away from the fact that this was a band of four very committed artists that were each committed to their craft, and they each had an idea, some would say an ideal, to make the Doors something other than a band that would sell out, other than a band that was chasing chart success, other than a band that would follow trends. They were a band that had their own sound. They consistently kept it. They resisted all sorts of pressures. There was the famous incident where they almost did a commercial for Buick by licensing Light My Fire. Jim said, "Okay, we'll do it, but only if I can be in the commercial smashing a Buick with a sledgehammer." General Motors said, "Thanks, but no thanks," at that point. So Let's remember Jim Morrison for all the things he was, rather than the things that he wasn't, but some people in the media may have wanted him to be. Let's remember him as a super interesting and innovative poet. Let's remember him as a man with an artist's soul that struggled and generally did remain pure. Let's remember him as a great vocalist, a great improviser, and one of the elements of a band that was truly bigger than the sum of all of its parts, even though all of its parts on their own were quite amazing. When you put it all together, it created something special, and nothing like it has been seen before or since. One of the bands that created a new LA sound by defying the LA sound that came before them and taking it internationally. And they live on playlists and on posters and in the minds and hearts of people throughout the world. So rest in power, Jim Morrison, a true, true classic for what he actually represented and who he actually was. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.